Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm Josh and this is Practical Apologetics. On this channel we talk about Christianity, theology, difficult Bible questions, and how to think through biblical issues in a practical and understandable way. Today I want to tackle one of the hardest accusations skeptics bring against the Old Testament. Does the Bible actually teach that women had to marry their abusers? Because if you've spent any amount of time online, you've probably seen this claim before. People will point to a passage in Deuteronomy and say, look, the Bible literally commands victims to marry the men who assaulted them. And before we go any further, I want to say this clearly. If that is truly what this passage is teaching, then that is deeply troubling. So instead of dodging the question, I want to carefully examine this head on. Look at the context, the Hebrew wording, and other related passages that may parallel this one. Because context matters. Now the passage people usually quote is Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 to 29, which says, "If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, and seizes her, and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he has violated her, he may not divorce her all of his days." Now I'm not going to pretend that's an easy passage. It's difficult and sounds very bad on the surface. And Christians should be completely honest about that. But after studying this passage carefully, I personally do not believe this is describing a violent assault scenario. And one major reason is because earlier in this exact same chapter, Deuteronomy already explicitly discusses violent assault. So let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 25, which just comes a few verses before, and it reads, "But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die." Now notice something important. In this earlier passage, the woman is innocent. The man is condemned, and the penalty to the man is death. This is clearly describing a violent attack scenario. And this is where the Hebrew wording becomes very important. In Deuteronomy 22, verse 25, the Hebrew word often associated with this violent assault scenario is chazaq, which means to overpower, to force, to prevail against, or to be strong against. Used in context involving physical force or overpowering someone. Now compare that to the wording used only a few verses later in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 28. The phrase there, translated seizes her, comes from a different Hebrew word, taphas, meaning to seize, to grasp, to take hold of, to handle. So the word itself does not automatically mean violent assault, but could simply mean to take hold of something and not involve force. Now I think this distinction is extremely important. Because if Moses intended to describe the exact same violent assault scenario again, only a few verses later, then why use a different Hebrew word? And why switch both the wording and the legal outcome? That's one of the major reasons I personally believe Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 28 to 29 is describing something very different. Now before we go further, I think it's important to understand something about the context of Deuteronomy itself. Because a lot of people don't realize Deuteronomy is essentially Moses restating and reaffirming God's law to a new generation of Israelites. The first generation had received the law decades earlier, right after leaving Egypt at Mount Sinai and being freed from slavery. But that generation rebelled against God and failed to enter the Promised Land. As a result, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation died off. Now Moses is speaking to their children, the new generation, preparing to enter the Promised Land. So Deuteronomy is not just random new laws appearing out of nowhere. Moses is reaffirming, expanding on, or restating the laws that had already been given earlier to the last generation. And that matters here, because there's an earlier law in Exodus 22 that many scholars believe is directly related to Deuteronomy 22. Now, before we read it, let me explain something important. In the Old Testament, there are sometimes what scholars call parallel laws. A parallel law is simply another law elsewhere in Scripture discussing the same or a very similar situation. And often those passages help clarify each other. Now listen to Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 to 17. It says, "If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins." Now personally, I believe Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 22 are discussing the same basic law being reiterated to a new generation, just with somewhat different wording and emphasis. And many respected Old Testament scholars hold a similar view. For example, Old Testament scholar Gordon Wenham, author of the book Story as Torah, argues these passages are closely parallel laws and should be interpreted together rather than isolated from each other. When you compare the passages, the similarities are hard to ignore. Both involve an unbetrothed virgin, intimate relations, financial responsibility, and a marriage obligation. And importantly, Exodus explicitly describes seduction. That's one of the major reasons I personally believe Deuteronomy 22 is not talking about violent assault, but rather fornication or seduction, involving an unbetrothed virgin. And there's another detail many people completely miss. In Exodus 22, the father can refuse the marriage, and the man still has to pay the financial price for what he did. That significantly changes the picture, because whether we view this as fornication or an assault, the law does not require the woman to marry the man no matter what, because her father would have to approve of the marriage. In fact, these laws appear focused on protecting and compensating the woman within a culture where a woman's future marriage prospects and financial security could be heavily affected after intimate relations outside of marriage. Now, before somebody misunderstands me, I want to be very clear. I'm not claiming ancient Israel was morally perfect, and I'm not saying there are no difficult Old Testament laws. But I do strongly disagree with the popular internet claim that the Bible commands a woman to marry her violent attacker. I do not believe that is what this passage is actually teaching. And I think when you study the chapter context, the Hebrew wording, the earlier parallel Exodus law, and the covenant context of Deuteronomy, the evidence strongly points towards this being a seduction or fornication law rather than a violent assault law. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think Exodus helps clarify Deuteronomy? Do you think these laws are parallel laws? Or do you think this remains one of the hardest passages in the Old Testament? Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment any apologetics or theology related topics you'd like me to cover next. And as always, thank you and God bless.